Treaty Talks is a podcast series that looks to break down the issues regarding this country's constitutional document, Te Tiriti or Waitangi, and the many impacts that have been born from this agreement between two nations. Tai hoa tātou karuku hōhonu atu ki ngā kōrero, he o anō i te tuatahi me whakatakoto tātou i te horopake. So much information about the treaty has been one-sided, convenient and deliberate. So this first episode is about setting the record straight and covering off the basics. We're going to talk to a group of lawyers, academics and experts who can break down Te Tiriti o Waitangi for us. Tuatahi ake ka kōrero au kia roimata Smail about what a treaty is and why a treaty is needed.
Well, I break it down the easiest way that I put in my education for primary school children is a treaty is a piece of paper with promises between two groups of people on it. I mean, that's as basic as you can get. And if you're talking about Te Tiriti or Waitangi, that's, again, paper, but it's between Māori and the Crown. And I always go back a bit when I'm trying to explain it. Is that okay if I do that?
Yeah, totally, because it's always important to look at the context of it, right?
So I always start, and my book starts and my education starts with that Māori discovered Aotearoa and Moriori discovered Rickards Chatham Islands. And I always start with that as the base because actually even some Kiwis don't really understand or know that.
Yeah.
That Māori owned all the land and had complete authority over their own lives, and that's most of the history of Aotearoa.
Yeah.
Then by 1840, Queen Victoria wanted the sole right to buy land here, and so she talked to chiefs about getting that sole right, a right of preemption. And at that time, there were already some British in Aotearoa, and some were misbehaving a bit. So she said, I'll get them under control in exchange for this sole right to buy land, and I'll offer you my protection. And she recognised in Te Tiriti the complete authority that Māori had always had over their lives and said that's not going to change. And that was discussed in Māori, written in Māori in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And it sort of followed on from he whakapūtanga 5 years earlier, which it was very much the same in terms of recognising Māori authority. Britain recognised that foreigners wouldn't be allowed to make laws in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So that's, I always try and give the background.
Yeah.
So that all kind of makes sense. The only thing is that there's another document. So that was Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The other document is the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah.
So it was in English. It wasn't discussed or agreed with Māori, and it said that the Queen would have sovereignty so that she could make laws over everyone in Aotearoa, including Māori. So, yeah, that's where the problem started.
Just to clarify for those who aren't aware, there are two treaties. Well, he nui ke. He o anō kotahi te kape reo Pākehā me ētahi kape reo Māori. And these can all be found at the National Library in Wellington, by the way. Anyone can go and see them. The English document was signed by only about 40 people. The Māori document was signed by over 500. And just in case you didn't get it, they say different things.
Well, I think what's most important, and I think some of the discussion has gone very much into the texts and so on. I think that what's most important is what was discussed and agreed. So what was discussed and agreed is what's in Te Tiriti. It's in the Māori version. Well, I don't even say the Māori version, I just call it Te Tiriti, that Māori document.
Yeah. So why did we need a treaty in the first place?
When you say we, I don't think Māori needed a treaty. The Queen needed Te Tiriti in order to get that right to buy land.
Because we were doing all right before they came, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, like I said, Māori owned all the land, ran everything, you know, had complete authority over their own lives.
Yeah.
And the Queen wanted the sole right to buy land. So really it was Britain that needed Te Tiriti. I think the way that it was sold to Māori was, well, you're already trading with people from Britain, and that's going really well. We could bring more. I know that, we know that there's some British already here and some are misbehaving.
Yeah.
The Queen's promising to, get them under control and govern them. And also there's other countries that maybe are a little bit interested in Aotearoa. The Queen will offer Māori her protection too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ki te hanga kāri te mōhio, he mārama te tiriti o Waitangi, e toru noa atikara. I asked Roimata about these articles.
So it's split into the 3 articles. Article 1, the Queen is promising to govern British people in Aotearoa.
Yeah.
Article 2 recognises Māori tino rangatiratanga complete authority over their lands, resources and kāinga, villages or way of life. Mm-hmm. But it also says if they decide that they would like to sell some land, they promise that they're just going to only deal with Britain. They'll only sell land to the Queen. And then Article 3 is offering, it says the Queen will offers her protection. So that's Te Tiriti. Mm-hmm. The treaty...
Just so we're clear, Roimata is now referring to the English document.
Article 1, instead of saying the Queen will govern British people in Aotearoa, kāwanatanga is the word used in the Māori, it says the Queen will have sovereignty. And sovereignty means the power to make laws over every person in Aotearoa. So obviously that's totally different. Māori Te Tiriti, she's only going to govern British people here in English. She can make laws over everyone. Article 2 is very similar. Both of Article 2 say Māori will hold on to their lands and their resources, and only if they want to sell, they're promising just to deal with the Queen.
Yeah.
It doesn't talk so much about the authority over their way of life.
Yeah.
And then Article 3 is the same about the Queen's protection.
Okay, so we're going to go back a bit before the treaty was signed. It's really important that we understand what was going on at that time. Peter Adds is the master of detail when it comes to history. Just as a note, we are brushing over quite a bit in this episode. However, in other episodes, we definitely delve a lot deeper, so make sure you check those out. When the treaty was signed, Māori outnumbered Pākehā 40-1, upwards of 80,000 Māori and around 2,000 Pākehā, but many of these Pākehā were causing a few issues around the place.
It was something that probably dawned on the Colonial Office in England, actually. The Colonial Office was like the Ministry of Colonial Affairs, pretty powerful office in the British administration in the 19th century. The Secretary of State for the Colonies was a pretty powerful position. He was also the Secretary of State for War. I think that possibly speaks to the significance of the role.
Yeah.
But the activities of Europeans who were slowly arriving in this country had come to their attention. Mm-hmm. And they realised that not all of the things that were going on here amongst Europeans, British people, were that savoury. And, well, by the 1830s, for sure, the British had lots of experience in different parts of the world establishing colonies. So India, some in Africa, a whole lot in the Bahamas, and the Australian colonies by the 1830s as well. And they'd done a lot of damage by then to Indigenous people. And the churches were not happy about it, and they wanted change. And this was starting to happen by the 1830s. So they realised at that point that they had to establish some official presence in this country. And as a result, in 1832, they created a position to do that.
Yeah.
The official British resident in New Zealand. And they appointed James Busby to that job. And he turned up here in 1833 to take on that role.
Right.
After James Busby arrived in 1835, a confederation of chiefs from Northland created and signed a document called He Whakaputanga, a declaration to the world that we are an independent nation. There's more on that in a later episode. This was drafted by Busby, but essentially these rangatira saw that some of these settlers were reckless and lawless. I tohu ki te ao ko rātou ngā rangatira, he whenua rangatira hoki ēnei. They also wanted to trade. They needed a flag to be an independent nation. This document is essential in understanding the full picture of the treaty.
The job was supposed to be about looking after Britain's interests in respect of this country and controlling British people in New Zealand, but they didn't give him any support to do that. He didn't get any judicial authority, for example, to control or British people living here. He didn't get any military presence to enforce anything. The only thing they gave him was a kit set house. Which he brought with him from Sydney in Australia. And when he arrived here, of course, he erected his house at Waitangi. Still stands today, often referred to as the Treaty House. It's Busby's original house that he erected in 1833 when he arrived here.
So when they appointed that position to him, were all the British people here intending on staying?
Yes, I think so. By now, there are not only missionaries in New Zealand, but there are lots of traders as well. The hub of European activity in this country had become Kororareka in the Bay of Islands. The town that today we call
I just
Russell.
used to hear stories about how it was just wild and everyone was drunk.
It was the Wild West of the Pacific, really. The hellhole of the Pacific, according to Charles Darwin. Yes, and consequently, lots of whaling ships were turning up there. So all that happened by the sort of mid-1835, really. But the other thing that's sort of critical to the story about all that happened in England, where a private company was in the throes of being established. The New Zealand Land Company, sometimes referred to as the New Zealand Company.
The New Zealand Company was established by Edward Wakefield, ia, locked up for kidnapping an underage woman. He made it his mission to sell the New Zealand dream to his fellow Englishmen: cheap farms, new lands, a new beginning. One of the biggest problems, though, was that he hadn't even set foot in Aotearoa. There was a lot of dodgy business going on here.
The treaty is essentially about stopping the company, because the Colonial Office realises that the company had to be stopped. But there was no British legal framework in New Zealand that could be used to do that, because they're now operating here. The only way to stop a company would be through the application of a legal framework in New Zealand. The only way to apply a legal framework in New Zealand would be to bring New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, into the empire. And that's the decision they took in 1839. We'll make this country a part of the British Empire, and then we can control the company. And of course they got Hobson to come to New Zealand and do this.
William Hobson is an absolute by the way. Hobson's Pledge that you hear about? Yeah, this is the Hobson they're talking about.
They do also take a decision that if they're going to do this, they're going to do it ethically. Because of the whole humanitarian thing again, we're going to get permission from Māori people to do it. The permission-getting process would be by way of treaty. And so William Hobson, this Irish naval captain, gets the job of coming to New Zealand to get permission from Māori people to do the job. He gets a set of instructions from the Colonial Office about what he's supposed to do here, from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, now Lord Normanby. The overarching instruction, it's a pretty cool looking document that they gave him. The overarching instruction was to secure sovereignty from Māori people for the Queen of England, is what Hobson was here to do. But it was all about stopping the company. The French were on the way too. But so there were several things in the mix, I suppose, but company was probably number one.
Hobson came here to get Māori to cede their sovereignty to the Queen, but this was never communicated to our tūpuna. Kātahi kamui ia te whenua e te Pākehā, ka parea ngā tikanga me ngā mātauranga ki tahaki. Te Wehi Wright, a treaty educator, explains more.
I'm a strong believer, like, it was culture genocide, and they wanted to make it like that. And you only have to have a look at some of the facts, some of the historical facts to see this was intentional. Before the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, there were some deliberate steps that led to to the negotiation of sovereignty in terms of the appointment of William Hobson. And then William Hobson starts to draft the treaty off a whole range of different notes, gets sick, hands it over to James Busby. They're 2 days out from having one of the biggest constitutional meetings in our history. And they decide about 4 p.m. on the 4th of February, let's translate this. So they give it to a Pākehā to translate, who gets our most important constitutional document. He receives it at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or the 4th, has to be delivered on Waitangi about 10 o'clock in the morning of the 5th, right? And then uses deliberate words that Māori are familiar with from previous writings, the Bible, or he whakaputanga, uses them slightly different in meaning, right, to entice Māori to sign, and then essentially giving the license to the British to set up their colonial systems and processes.
And see, because lots of people wouldn't think that that was deliberate and that it's just this big misunderstanding, and that Pākehā, Māori had read the Te Tiriti and read the treaty and that they were the same. And that's always like this constant myth and argument that people seem to have about the difference between the two documents.
Yeah, and to be honest, like I actually get a little bit hoha because they try and pull us down into that. Like they pull us into that debate so that we end up debating the semantics and the specifics of it. But actually, if you elevate it and you look at it for what it is, like you can't deny it. This was deliberate.
Yeah.
You know, the intentional misuse of Māori terms, and then everything that happened immediately after in terms of not just what they legislated, but how they legislated for the next 150 years to make us exactly as we are. Now, even though I talk about the deliberate misuse of Māori terms, for me, when it comes to the balancing of the treaty and Te Tiriti, there's no misunderstanding, right? Over 500 rangatira signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Yep, maybe 40 signed the treaty. There's a lot of debate as to why that's the case. Some said there was no room in the Māori text, right? There were 9 copies in total. 8 of those were in Māori.
Yeah.
Only 1 was in English, right? And then they even try and attack our social structures by saying, yeah, but you only allowed 13 wahine to sign the treaty. Whereas what we know, and there's evidence that suggests there were more wahine that wanted to sign, but because of the way in which Pākehā systems operated back then, they didn't see wahine as being rangatira, so they didn't let them sign. Secondly, ka wehe ana te tāne I te kāinga, ki te mate ia, ko oro tonu te iwi. Ki te wehe te wahine I te kāinga, ka mate I reira, ko mate te iwi. And so you see in these discussions the constant attempts to minimize and to colonialize our own thinking. And I think the fact that we're constantly debating the differences in the text is another example of that. Because when it comes to, in my opinion, when it comes to text, there's no misunderstanding. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the founding constitutional document that was built on the back of he whakaputanga. And if I was to compare them, one reaffirmed those rights that were introduced or that were declared in he whakaputanga. The other one has tried its best for a long time to take them away.
Yeah.
Shortly after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, in May 1840, William Hobson put out a proclamation saying that Māori had ceded their sovereignty to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. This is definitely not what was signed and agreed to in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. However, he went with it anyway, and then the bad got even worse.
After the treaty signing process, 8 months of signing, by the way, and by May of 1840, Hobson proclaimed that New Zealand was now part of the empire.
Yeah.
Once the signing process stopped, Hobson attempted to establish an administration in this country, in New Zealand. Has a couple of buildings built in the Bay of Islands. Sets up a court system in that administration, a land purchasing office, and establishes 3 new provincial governments in New Zealand. Gives them Irish names: New Ulster, New Munster, and New Leinster. And so from day one, actually, Hobson is establishing a very Westminster style of administration in this country. Once that's up and running, and once it's eventually transferred to Auckland, there's a constitutional change, actually. Right at the start of that process, we were a dependency of New South Wales in Australia. And the Governor of New South Wales and Sydney, Governor Gipps, was also going to be the Governor of New Zealand. And that was the situation after the treaty was signed. But then when Hobson moved to Auckland in 1841, that was changed. And Hobson became a full governor of New Zealand, not Gipps, and our status changed to full colony at that point. From a British perspective, you know. Pretty early on in that experience, the Crown, Hobson and co. realised that Māori people had no intention of giving up their sovereignty, like they thought they should, because of the invalid English version of the treaty. And so they strategised to try and change that.
Yeah.
And they tried different things through the 1840s. They all failed. When all that stuff failed, they started a war against Māori people.
Yeah.
Arguably by 1845, only 5 years after the treaty was signed. And of course, that's a war that Māori people comprehensively lost. Somewhere during that war, between 1845 and, shall we say, 1881, with Parihaka, the population dynamics reversed. Somewhere between 1855 and 1860, according to demographers, there were now more Pākehā people in New Zealand than Māori. Māori population was still in decline through disease, through all of this, now warfare, scorched earth warfare as well, but certainly by 1860. And of course that was always going to have a profound impact on the power relations between Māori and the Crown. Once there were more Europeans in New Zealand, the Crown was going to find it much easier to get its way over Māori people than earlier.
It took Hobson 12 years to start a parliament here, which is bugger all really. Instantly, Te Tiriti, this document with so much hope and promise for a prosperous future, was left out of it, and so were we, Māori. He taumahanga kōrero nei, heoi anō ki au. This is our history, Veronica Tawhai explains.
The settler parliament, the act, which is now the New Zealand Parliament that we have, but it was initially called the Settler Parliament, came out of the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act. You know, we have our first elections 1853, they have their first sittings, in 1854, and we know right from 1855, the tipuna of Ngāti Haua Tarapipipi, he's going to, talk to them about what actually, how is it that yous are going to work? Yous need to be in communication with Māori. He then proposes, this relationship. We know that doesn't work out. We then have, the very next massive, significant constitutional thing we have then, of course, is the establishment of the kingitanga. Yeah. We then have things like the kotahitanga parliament. And there have been different initiatives throughout our history that we've tried. Some of them have been like that, like a parliament type structure. Others have been more autonomous movements where they've said, well, no, we're going to exist here. We're going to continue to operate under Māori law. Pākehā, you can, be out here, you're welcome here, yeah, but we're going to carry on here, And so there's been lots and lots of different things, but the one thing that they have in common has been about the ongoing exercise of our tino rangatiratanga, because that has been primarily what Parliament's challenge, and what it's called, sis, is parliamentary sovereignty. So parliamentary sovereignty is the idea that the laws that Parliament passes are then the highest laws of the land. They are the supreme law, and what happens there goes, and it's basically, for example, enforceable. So there might be things where if you then break that law, you get a fine, or you go to jail, or you go to, and the issue is that those things have clashed with us, and how we do things.
Making parliamentary laws and passing acts and bills some of the ways that they totally screwed us over?
All of the ways.
All of the ways.
Yes, but the ability to do so in the very early days was by force, So what we know is that they established the settler parliament. That settler parliament whānau, just FYI, is only meant to be for settlers, which is what kāwanatanga is about, Kāwanatanga is about allowing, that was about allowing one governor here to be able to govern, the British subjects that were here. They have then set up their parliament, but even then they're not to pass laws about Māori, including Māori land. That relationship is maintained with the British Crown. What happens is that in the 1860s,
they throw that out along with the rest of the treaty, let alone Te Tiriti, sis. They throw those things out, and then what happens is that New Zealand becomes a settler colony. Now, settler colony specifically, for those of you who've never heard about it, settler colonialism, okay, right. This is now, right, Whānau, we're going to spend 5 minutes in the geek life, okay? Yeah, well, all it is that, so colonisation, we've had a very specific form of colonisation happen here, which is how they managed to enforce the laws. And that is that basically colonisation, you might set up a colony and it's about the extraction of resources to help the motherland, right? It's about their economy, etc. And what happens across the globe is that, you might have this colonial power extract these resources, which has included people, as we know in the history of colonies, but then they go. So those nations are sometimes considered to be decolonised because the power of governance has gone back then to the local people. But what we had here was a very specific form of colonialism called settler colonialism, and that's when the colonial power goes, actually, the resource that I need here isn't what we can extract. The resources, the resources that we need here is the land, and what we need the land for is as a home for our people. And so you natives that are on this land, what we need you to do is go. And so, many ways that Māori have been made to go, so shifted off our lands, die, through diseases, be that through war, be that through, Usually then what happens in a settler colony is that then those natives that are left, they are then used just like a resource in terms of a labour force, so then what is extracted is our human labour, and this is where you see all the structural introduction of, education, which then ensures that we're going to be a labouring, uneducated class, which is exactly what happened here. So all those acts that you're talking about, it's only because of then, so clear the land of the natives, but then bring over others, and so this is how that works. This is that, so we know that between 1860 and 1900, that it was about 200,000 a decade is how the Pākehā population expanded. So 1852, when they first set up Parliament, it's between 54 and 56,000 is how many Pākehās are here. And by 1890, it's just short of 1 million.
Wow.
So we become a minority in this time, a politically no longer self-governing minority, where it's no longer about us welcoming a space in for our British friends, as treaty partners, making them a space here on our lands. By 1900s, as you know, what they're discussing is, will our Māori even going to survive, or if they're going to become extinct, and this has been transformed into Little England, a slice of Britain in the Pacific. And it's these numbers, sis, that enable the enforcement of these laws. It's the numbers that include armies, that include military, and so it's by force that those things happen. But this is it, whānau, this is why it's important that we have an understanding of settler colonialism. It's about clearing the land of the natives to make way, for others, of the colonial power. And this is how we see in a very short period of time. It's really, 1850s to, we know that by 1920 we have 8% of Aotearoa's whenua that's still in Māori, stewardship. And it's that over this very quick period of time we have the stewardship of Aotearoa, our taonga, etc., shift from the hands of our Māori ancestors into the hands of our European ancestors, and at that same time that's happening, 1860s, they then start building New Zealand, the education system, the health system, the political system. And so that's what makes things like this so scary, sis. You were right about it being scary, is because the types of things that they're talking about, this is the thinking that's happening, at the time, is that actually no, there isn't a special place for Māori as tangata whenua here in Aotearoa. What we're doing is that we're building a society where those things are not valued,
Colonisation is rough, especially on our minds. On the bright side, kei konei tonu tātou, and we are strong. We still challenge everything that the government does. The fights that take place today is a continuation of those that have gone before us. One of the key battles, fixing narratives. Te Kōtuku explains.
I think especially as a child, and you might have experienced this too, I think a lot of Māori experiences this, is that we kind of go through, especially in the settler society that we have now, we go through these myths. Papa Moana Jackson talks about them in terms of mistakes. You know, that Māori, we just kind of, it's the parachute myth that he talks about, that, you know, Māori just woke up one day and decided to cede all of their, you know, mana and tino rangatiratanga over to this woman in England that they'd never met before, which is just a crazy, but that is something that is perpetuated onto us as tamariki or in society, and that is the reason why we have things like a settler parliament or, you know, stuff like that. That's, all of those are mistakes. So I think one of the key differences that I've learned is that, is what Papa Moana talks about in terms of the myths and the mistakes, and that we didn't, obviously, never ceded our mana and authority. And so our responsibility and obligation now going forward, it's in terms of the restoration of tino rangatiratanga. The overcomplicating of Te Tiriti has been very deliberate, and the fact is it's not that complicated to understand, you know. Pākehā, you have a governor to govern you and, you know, the governance of your lives, but Māori, we will retain authority and mana and governance over ourselves. You know, that sounds quite simple to me. You know? And then there's Article 3 talks about the rights of, all the rights and privileges of British subjects. That had to do about trade. You know, that was all about trade, because we were a trading people. We were very economically wealthy as a people. You know, so it was a simple framework, basically, and it's just simple to understand it. But again, it's not the fault of our people that it's been interpreted in a complicated way, because I do think that's been a deliberate approach by the system, obviously.
Well, it's convenient for them, right, to say that, well, we don't really understand it.
Well, you see it in our current government today, you know, is that they're trying to define what Te Tiriti means and to overcomplicate the interpretation of Te Tiriti, so that we get more kind of grey areas around that, and so that more people are not properly informed about Te Tiriti, and then Te Tiriti becomes this distant kind of thing that doesn't need to be acknowledged or isn't acknowledged. You know, and so the colonising power maintains power. I think it's not just in the mahi that Tiriti educators or Tiriti practitioners do, but it's what us as Māori do in general, every day. I think our mere existence is a resistance against the settler colonial state. But one of the kōrero that I love from Papa Moana Jackson, who was one of our mentors and has been so critical in the consciousness raising around Te Tiriti in this country, is that he talks about the parachute myth that I just mentioned before, that is a common treaty example that he uses, you know, that Māori just woke up one day and decided to cede their sovereignty to that woman in England we'd never met before. What he says is that it's not really about the question, but behind the question. And when I heard this, I remember I just bursted into tears, because what he says, it's not about the question, it's behind the question, is that our people have to have faith within ourselves that our tipuna would never have done that to us. Which I thought was so powerful.
Today, Māori are loud and proud. Māori didn't cede their sovereignty. There's only one valid document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
I don't actually think it's contentious anymore. So the Waitangi Tribunal, 10 years ago, they wrote a report about it. So it was called He Whakaputanga me Te Tiriti. And they said Māori and the Crown only ever discussed the Queen controlling British people in New Zealand. So Māori never gave away their right to self-govern. They never said the Queen could make laws over them. And the Waitangi Tribunal said then so that's 10 years ago now, that actually leading authorities, leading scholars, both Māori and Pākehā, have been saying that for a generation or more.
Yeah.
So it hasn't quite filtered through. And I have some of that report quoted in my little book. But I would say that that's actually not controversial.
Yeah.
But most New Zealanders, I don't think, know.
Yeah.
If we do not learn from history, we're condemned to relive it.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand that we have a history made up of not two races, but two nations. The Māori nation existed prior to the treaty. It engaged in a treaty with another nation. And if you look at the Te Tiriti, the last few words of the first clause, where we tuku atu ki te kuini o Ingarangi, the rangatiratanga o rātou whenua, not mātou whenua,
Yeah.
not tātou whenua, rātou whenua. We knew exactly what we were signing. We gave to her the right to govern her lands.
Yeah.
What I think's a great place for people to look for the whole detailed story is that report, He Whakaputanga me Te Tiriti,
Yeah.
from 10 years ago by the Waitangi Tribunal. What I sort of try to get across in sharing the basics is that report's really clear, has looked at all of the evidence, like no one ever has before in Aotearoa,
Yeah.
and said this is what was discussed, was a right of preemption in exchange for protection, basically, that it's very clear that Māori never gave away their rights.
Yeah.
I think, I've learned a lot of this stuff as an adult as well,
Yeah.
right? So I think the starting point is that there's this hunger to learn. And I'm very, very grateful for those that came before us and really kind of broke through in academic spaces and our researchers and our historians and our tohunga of all types. But I almost feel like the second or third generation of that, and I feel very privileged and humbled to be a part of that. But we can read about it, we can learn, and we have all these tauira are learning through social media, and there are a million ways in which we can now get accurate information about Te Tiriti.
Well, yeah, because what is it that you set out to achieve when you started Treaty Chats? Like, how te whakaaro o te rā?
I think it was that things were happening so quickly, and there's this real need to demystify information about the treaty, because it's not as confusing as some people would have you believe, and there is that misinformation out there, but that's a deliberate tactic. Te Tiriti is very clear. It is about our tino rangatiratanga as Māori being preserved. And from there, in my opinion, it's about creating a system of government where tangata whenua can retain that authority and those ways of life that we have always had, we have had for 1,000 years. But equally, it's about saying there are new people coming to Aotearoa now. How do we create a system that preserves our rights, because that kind of goes without saying at the time, but also invites people in and also says, well, we will need laws and policies that improve your lives as well, and we can do that. Kāwanatanga exists for that reason. And so this relationship between tino rangatiratanga for Māori and kāwanatanga for governments is kind of a simple one, to be honest. It's two groups of people sharing power for the benefit of each other, and that at its core is what it's about. But what we are seeing right now is rapid change. And so when there is a new law in Parliament every other week, and there's a new Waitangi Tribunal report every month or two, people are, I think, wanting to know those things and wanting to be informed.
E hoa mā, it's so important that we don't leave anyone behind. We are kind to each other. What we've been through sucks, but our tūpuna did the best to protect and look after us. I don't think they would have ever dreamed of a generation as strong as us coming through next. We are loud, proud and strong, and we have to make sure we never leave anyone behind.
And not to get geeky.
No, geeky.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
And we're all geeks at the end of the day, Māori, but, you know, this comes from a critical theorist that I studied back in uni, and his name is Antonio Gramsci. So it was some years ago, and I don't want to butcher where he was from, but it was during the time of Hitler. He was imprisoned, Antonio Gramsci, and so he wrote these things called the prison books. And in the prison books, he talks about this term called hegemony. And hegemony is ultimately what he was exploring. Was he just couldn't understand why people were just blindly following Hitler at the time, basically. He just couldn't understand it. So he came up with this term, hegemony. And it's basically where we start to really adopt the colonisers' ideals and views and beliefs and attitudes and approaches of us as native people. Mm-hmm. That's what hegemony means. And so when we truly start to adopt those ideals, we start to believe in what the coloniser believes of ourselves, and it advances the colonial project, obviously. But that's what Papa Moana talks about in terms of the colonisation of our minds. And so going back to what he has also talked about in the past in terms of having absolute utter faith within ourselves, a part of the restoration of tino rangatiratanga is removing ourselves from the dominant grip of hegemony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like an easy thing to do when that's been happening to people for so long. How do we go about changing that and removing ourselves? What is the process, I suppose?
It's definitely an ongoing project, but it's, I don't see it as super difficult. It's conscientisation, basically. You know, it's the raising of political, social awareness for the purposes of positive action. But for example, kohanga reo is the ultimate epitome, perfect example of the restoration of tino rangatiratanga. Now, that's not to say that they don't struggle, that kohanga reo whānau don't struggle under a kāwanatanga-led or settler colonial system, and that's why it's so important to get towards the restoration of TR, or tino rangatiratanga. But yeah, the kohanga reo is the perfect example of conscientising, basically, and yes, it was very difficult for our, nenes and aunties that protested and did all of the hard yards to get it there, but that was quite a simple example of how we can free ourselves from the grip of the colonisation of our minds, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think people as well need to understand that all of these things that happened in our past, it is just a really small part of our history, but that some of the ways that we behave or the things that we feel are not our fault.
Yeah, absolutely not, yeah. And I think that's one of the critical facets that we need, particularly in these resistance movements. There's a really powerful quote that I heard this year. It's by a man called Kwame Ture, but traditionally he's known as Stokely Carmichael, and so he was of the time of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. He was a huge mover and shaker in the Black Panther and Black Power movement over in America. African American, I think he was born in Trinidad, but moved to New York. And there's a quote that he talks about in terms of, a lot of our people, and he's referring to the context of Black Americans, but this is still applicable to us as Indigenous peoples, but he talks about how a lot of our people are unconscious, but that doesn't mean they don't want liberation. Just because they're unconscious doesn't mean they don't want freedom, and I think that's, like, in terms of a Māori perspective, for me, that's a real kind of framework of aroha, and that kind of shows how critical and important it is. And I know it sounds so corny, but critical and important it is to have absolute undying aroha for our people and understanding and compassion for the context that they're in, and that, yes, they might have, might be perpetuating, colonising approaches or practices or rara, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, we have to understand that that's not their fault. And so we have to move forward with that kind of understanding of themselves, and then having complete aroha, and love and compassion for us, especially if we want to get to this movement of the restoration of tino rangatiratanga, get out of the current system that we have now that is just continuing to perpetuate harm upon our people.
Alright, hoa mā, that's the first episode. E mihi ana ki ngā kai kōrero katoa. Plenty more in-depth wānanga and other episodes, so make sure you check them out.